Before I resume, I assume the reason you're all here today is that you know there's a quiz Friday, right? Okay. Just making sure you all know. It really shouldn't be hard for you if you've been coming to class. Okay, so, to resume where we left off, Hitler is, of course, as I said, discredited. He's not entirely repudiated. There was sort of a double standard for political prisoners in Weimar Germany. Many people, I haven't even used that term yet, but you should probably know the term. This being simply, where they wrote the Constitution, but it has become a historical shorthand for the era, that is, of the German Republic lasting from 1912 to, I suppose you have to say 1933, when Hitler comes to power. So the Weimar regime, such as it was, does recover somewhat. This statesman, I did write his name down there, I'll write it again over on this side, Gustav Stresemann. He, in a way, is the political side of the kind of stabilization, that is, the regime recovering its feet. He himself was actually a politician of the right, certainly more than Hitler was, in the sense that he was fairly conservative, definitely patriotic. In fact, he himself had denounced the Versailles Treaty ad nauseum. It was partly for that reason that he had the kind of street credibility, you might say, to eventually accept payment. What I wrote up here, the phrase sometimes used to describe Stresemann's policy is fulfillment, just basically meaning the Germans finally agreed to pay. Now, how much they were going to pay, I'll get to that in a moment. There are a couple of factors then working together which eventually produced a settlement. Hitler's being discredited, that was part of it. The communists being discredited, or as usual, discrediting themselves, that was part of it. Both of their failures to seize power in kind of putsches, cut the legs out from under the hard left and the hard right, making it a little bit easier for the center to hold. But the real factor which made it possible was the stabilization of the German currency. Now, this was done in an incredibly clever way by a man called Hjalmar Schacht. I know I wrote his name somewhere, but anyway, I'll write it again. Actually, he had a really goofy name. His actual name was Horace Greeley Hjalmar Schacht. His first two names were actually American because one of his parents was American, and they named him after this famous American political figure. His German name, spelled rather oddly with an HG. You should at least remember his last name. He's actually the subject of several biographies. He's known to posterity principally now as, quote-unquote, Hitler's banker, because he was one of the key kind of bankers to defect to Hitler in the early 1930s. But long before that, he was seen as the architect of essentially the end of the German hyperinflation. Now, he took a couple of steps, which were kind of ingenious when you put them together. First, he proclaimed that he was going to basically issue a new currency. They called it the Rentenmark. Renten coming from rents, meaning it was pledged to land, basically. In a way, he got the idea from the French Revolution with the so-called assignats, you might remember from last term, which were pledged against the lands held by the church. In this case, it was theoretically going to be state-held land. But he never intended this currency to be permanent. What he basically wanted to do is to set it up as a foil. This currency, he would encourage people to buy. That is, it wasn't backed by land. It wasn't backed by gold. It was backed by land. But he didn't say exactly what the exchange rate would be yet. So what he did was he waited for the mark to fall even further. It had already crossed the trillion barrier. He waited until it fell to exactly 4.2 trillion to the dollar. This was on about, I think, November 20th, which was about 10 days after the beer hall putsch. So it's kind of like things are beginning to settle down politically. Still, the mark is still tumbling against the dollar. But every day it tumbled further was in a way good for the German government, because you remember the German government is now inflating away its debts. In fact, on an overall debt, I've got the figure here, that is internal debt, just debt held by Germans. equivalent to about $30 billion. That is expenditures mostly on the First World War. The German government eventually settled for the equivalent of 45 million. That is, again, less than a kurush to the lira. About a tenth of the kurush to the lira is what the Germans actually paid on their own internal debt. Thus, again, screwing over their own citizens, but essentially emerging without internal debt. So this was clever, partly because he allowed the currency to tumble further. But the 4.2 figure was symbolically important. That was the figure the German currency had been pegged to the dollar at before the war. So, when he weighted it, deliberately defaulted this precise figure, 4.2 trillion. That is when he introduced the Rentenmark, saying it would be traded at 1 trillion to the Deutschmark. Essentially meaning that it would be like the old German currency at about 4.2 to the dollar. Now, it didn't just magically solve the problem. In fact, for another couple of weeks, the mark continued tumbling, to like 10 trillion to the dollar, 20 trillion to the dollar. But then amazingly, it kind of bounced back. And eventually it did settle in at about 4.2 trillion to the dollar, meaning that the new Rentenmark would be at about 4.2 to the dollar. Eventually they would rename this too. It's confusing because the Rentenmark looks like RM. Eventually they introduced a new so-called Reichsmark, which is also initials RM. They're the same basic thing. It's just the first one was backed by land and the second was backed by dollar. It's called the RM. And this is then finally pledged at 4.2 to the dollar. So, the first step, stabilizing the currency. This allowed normal commerce to resume, as you can expect. Because without the uncertainty of waiting basically for the next 30 minutes, 20 minutes for prices to change, with that kind of uncertainty, you can't really do business of any kind. Now you can begin to plan, you can begin to invest. And so normal economic life begins to return. The goods start appearing again in the shelves, there aren't shortages. The paranoia and the crazy anti-Semitism finally dies down just a little bit. The Nazi share of the vote declines. The communist share of the vote declines too. The parties of the center begin to strengthen. All of this eventually points the way to a kind of political stabilization as well. That said, though, they still had to worry about the reparations. Now, the reparations issue was extremely difficult. Remember, as I've said, the French obviously were angry they weren't being paid. That's what caused the whole Ruhr crisis in the first place. They were also angry that their own allies were not forcing the Germans to pay. In fact, I didn't mention this in the first half of the hour, although maybe I should. The real reason the Ruhr crisis eventually ended, that is, and the Germans eventually decided that they would pay, is because the British finally announced in September that they would support the French policy. After 8 months of chaos, the British finally said, okay, we'll back you. So it was the fact that the Germans now realized they couldn't play the Allies off against each other that led Stresemann, first with kind of emergency powers, and then he'll be foreign minister and then chancellor. Stresemann represents the kind of, again, the return of the normal in Germany, the fulfillment policy. He finally agrees to do this basically because at long last the British and the French have teamed up. That said, it's still not clear how much the Germans are going to pay. The French want the full $12.5 billion in fairly large installments. The Germans are claiming they can't pay that. In a way, though, the Germans have just undercut their own argument because, after all, they have just inflated away their own internal debt. So, well, look, you don't have debt anymore. So you can afford the reparations. That's what the French say. Now, the British, again, they don't really support the French. Neither quite do the Americans. But eventually everyone realizes that they have to come up with some kind of a plan. I mean, all these international conferences had never really produced any sort of a plan. In fact, the lack of a plan for repayment had eventually led to probably the most notorious agreement signed in the interwar period, the Rapallo Agreement. And I'm going to talk about this in a moment. Basically, with Britain, France, and America all squabbling, and the Germans refusing to go along, in part because Britain, France, and America were all squabbling, the Germans decided to make their own settlement with the Russians. A settlement which sometimes is simply called, a settlement between two pariah states, that is, two states which were outside the international system. It's like two rogue or renegade states, as we might call them today, which made a lot of sense. They canceled each other's debts, and again, to use this rather vulgar metaphor, they basically raised their middle finger at the West. It wasn't just about debts, though. It was signed in Italy. It was supposed to be a conference where they were supposed to cut a deal with the other side, with the Americans, the British, and the French. The conference was held at Genoa. Secretly, the Russians and the Germans went to the nearby town of Rapallo, and another phrase for this agreement, which I'm kind of fond of, is the pajama party. Pajamas being like what you wear to bed at night, because the whole thing was supposedly actually signed over drinks like at 3 in the morning between the German Walter Rathenau and Karl Radek for the Bolsheviks, for the Russians. Both of them not incidentally Jewish. In fact, Rathenau, and this is kind of ironic because Rathenau is nothing but a patriot. I mean, he signs this agreement, which is entirely in Germany's interest, against the Versailles settlement. But Rathenau, simply by virtue of being Jewish and being a foreign minister and then a finance minister, is a symbol of the regime. And he's eventually executed or assassinated by right-wing, anti-Semitic fanatics. But anyway, the roots of this agreement is pretty simple. They cancel their debts, but more important than that, they agreed on a kind of covert military cooperation plan. Basically, the Germans were not allowed to develop weapons. They weren't allowed to have a navy. They weren't allowed to have an air force. They weren't allowed to build tanks. Nothing offensive or strategic. They're limited to 100,000 troops. So the Germans can't really do a lot of kind of experimenting with new weapons. That is in Germany, where the Allies are watching. So instead, they do it in Russia. This is where they literally developed the famous, the Stuka dive bomber, as it was called. The one that actually had this siren that they would ring to terrify people right before they bombed them in the Second World War. They developed the Stuka dive bomber and a lot of other weapons inside Russia. Now, the Russians got a lot out of it, too. They basically got to share German weapons technology. In fact, ironically, the Germans basically taught the Russians how to build tanks, and then the Russians used these tanks to beat the Germans in the Second World War. So it kind of came back to bite the Germans eventually. But in the short run, it was great, because they got to test all of these weapons, and they got to try out new things. They were also helping to train the communists basically in kind of like how to run a proper army. So they both got something out of the deal, which was, again, kind of like a giant middle finger raised at the West to outlaw regimes agreeing to collaborate in secret. Again, giving the Germans no incentive to cut a deal with the West. Eventually, again, it's only when France and Britain finally team up in fall of 1923 that the Germans give in and decide to pay reparations. But how much are they going to pay? Well, they're going to pay a bit more than they were doing before, but not that much more. The Americans basically finally kind of took over. The Americans were the ones with all the power. Remember, they have all the money, they have all the gold, they've got the leverage, they've got the power. Even so, America's kind of isolationist foreign policy in the 1920s did not really allow direct political involvement. So the Americans didn't even really send over government officials. They sent over kind of unofficial bankers. 2 of them. There was Dawes and there was a guy called Young. And these are the 2 bankers that pretty much put together the kind of reparations settlement of the 1920s. The first of them agreed in 1924. Now, Dawes' idea was partly political. He realized that there was no way the French would allow the $12.5 billion sum to be reduced. It was a symbolic figure. France wanted that money. They wanted it badly. So he didn't lower the sum. What he did was restructure the payments, so they would go over more years, like over a longer period. The initial payments would only be about $250 million a year. They were supposed to ramp up gradually to about $600 million a year, so that at that rate, literally it was going to take, several decades for the Germans to pay back. The French complained, rightly so, that if you factored in interest payments, it was basically like they had reduced the total amount of the debt. But the French had to take what they could get. The French were really in no position to negotiate. And so the Germans did begin paying money to France. By the time of the stock market crash in 1929, they paid about $1 billion, which, of course, the Germans had just borrowed from the Americans. And then the French, of course, in turn, were supposed to pay back money to Britain, which in turn paid it back to America. So that the whole thing, although it had the appearance of settling matters, really didn't accomplish a whole heck of a lot. The French had a point, but then again, if the Germans couldn't afford to pay much more than this, then maybe the Americans should have just stepped in and forgave all the debts that everyone else owed them. Eventually, America did have to forgive the debts, in part. They were all settled at different amounts. Britain settled first, which also meant they had to pay the most. They settled for, I don't remember, it was like 70 or 80%, that is, cents on the dollar. They knocked off some of the debt, but not all. France held out a bit longer in paying, and so France eventually cut a better deal where they didn't have to pay as much of their debts. It was at the cost, though, of several more years, from about 22 to 25, where the franc lost value against the dollar. Now, I mentioned that before, that Britain basically chose this policy of like hard money, which is to say a strong pound going back on the gold standard. France's more inflationary policy had certain benefits. It allowed French exports to be much more competitive than Britain's, so you could say it was a spur to employment. Again, these issues may sound kind of arcane and boring, but it is against the backdrop of all of this that Keynes developed his essential kind of theories, which are now almost orthodox economics in the modern world, which has to do with interest rates, money and debt, and how it all supposedly works together with employment. It was as Keynes was actually observing all of this that he developed his theories. So the idea was that Britain had kind of gotten it wrong. Britain had interest rates which were too high because they were trying to keep the pound artificially high, so they had chose hard money at the expense of employment. France had chosen softer money, so they had better employment, but on the other hand, their currency was weaker. It all sounds really abstract until you look at it in personal terms. Look at it this way. France with a weak currency becomes really cheap to foreigners. In fact, it became ridiculously cheap, particularly to Americans. Have any of you ever read like Hemingway, novels by Hemingway or F. Scott Fitzgerald? Some of the classics of American literature, almost all of them in the 1920s and 30s, are set in Europe. This is partly because if you were an American in the 1920s and you had dollars, you could go to Europe and you could live like a king. You could set up in the Ritz-Carlton hotel, drink in the hotel bar every night, and just basically live there on pennies, pretty much. You could buy up property. In fact, all these gauche young Americans were buying up land on the French Riviera, which is now some of the most expensive real estate in the world. It was a bargain for them. France turned into this sort of bargain basement paradise for Americans and also for Brits who had money because the pound was strong. So that even though France might have had a lower unemployment rate than Britain, it didn't seem that way to Frenchmen, who seemed, shall we say, not only resentful that Britain and America weren't supporting them against Germany, but also kind of humiliated. These foreigners are coming in and basically buying up the country. Now, this is always true in hyperinflationary or inflationary times. People with hard assets or hard currencies, that is foreign currencies, can make a killing. And it eventually poisons the political atmosphere. In fact, in a really odd way, France became a magnet for the world in the 20s and 30s. It was so cheap, and then France also being France, great wine and great food, that everyone went there. If you watch the movie Casablanca, one of the movies we could watch. Has anyone seen it, by the way? It's you see all these people coming through France. France was a big refugee for Jews, among others, who were coming from Germany as anti-Semitism got really bad there. It was a big haven for refugees from Russia. It's where Nabokov and some of those white Russian emigres holed up. And also these just kind of bargain hunting or adventurous Americans. The country was it was taken over by foreigners, practically. That's what it seemed like to the French. So some of this also, there's a racial tinge to it. I mean, the French, they weren't as bad in the kind of anti-Semitic racism game as the Germans were in the 1920s and 30s. But there was a lot of xenophobia and resentment of foreigners. This feeling of national decline. And part of the reason why so many people were coming to France, aside from the low prices and the good food and wine, is that there weren't that many French people anymore. Like if you go back, I talked about this last term with Napoleon, that in some ways the real long-term legacy of the Napoleonic Wars was to carve a huge hole in the French population. You know, all of those men of arms bearing, that is to say also childbearing age, killed in the wars, did not have children. And eventually you got this kind of demographic hole that just kept digging away at France. It's not that the population declined in the 1800s. It's that it stayed more or less the same, where all the other populations in Europe were going like this. You know, so that one by one the French get overtaken, that is passed in population terms. You know, Russia passes them very early in the 1800s. The Germans pass them in, 1870. Eventually Britain passes them too. Eventually even the Italians have more people than France. And so the French have this sense of relative decline, which has mostly to do with demography. This is one of the reasons why France had so much in terms of foreign bond holdings, that is, in places like Russia and even the Ottoman Empire, because there was nothing to invest in France. I mean, finance, when it really comes down to it, is a pretty simple thing. It's old people lending money to young people. Old people because they have money, usually, and they don't need to spend that much. Young people need to raise families and buy houses, and they don't have money to do it, and so they borrow it. A country like France, though, which starts running out of young people, has to find somewhere else to invest. So it's a sign of financial health in a way, but a sign of kind of social and societal weakness. France, basically, its population is now stagnant. In fact, even during the war, with all of its losses, Britain's population rose from 1914 to 1918. France's population did not rise at all. France is basically just kind of like treading water. And more than treading water, what's happening is, of course, the population is getting older. You have fewer young people. You have the 1.4 million men who died in the war. You have another 1.1 million men who have lost arms or legs. Now, they weren't all impotent. Some of them probably could physically have had children, but that said, most of them were not having children. And so you have another big demographic gap. This obsession, I mean, it becomes a major political thing. They call it natalité, basically the birth rate. It's like the biggest issue in French politics. Really, throughout the 1920s and 30s. I mean, it gets to the point where, when the French surrender to the Germans in 1940, the new sort of pseudo-dictator, Philippe Pétain, gives this speech, basically saying, yes, we lost the war because we had too few babies. That was an excuse. It wasn't really the reason France had lost the war, but maybe in a kind of more fundamental sense, there was a point there, because it had to do with national morale. You just didn't have the vigor. You didn't have the young people. You know, young people who, frankly, are sometimes stupid, but on the other hand, they have a lot of energy and enthusiasm. Whereas old people, they tend to be a little bit more practical-minded and conservative. You know, and there's something to be said for that, too. You want the yin and the yang. You want a bit of a balance. But France had all of the one and not enough of the other. So France's kind of national morale gets subtly corroded by all of this. You know, by the feeling of being betrayed by America and Britain. By, again, the fact that they have all of this money owed to them that doesn't get paid. You know, money debts that just basically get wiped out by the Russians and then, eventually by the Germans. By the subtle but slow and inexorable decline of the currency. You know, which, again, affects morale because all these foreigners come in and buy up everything. And then, of course, last but not least, by the stagnant and then eventually declining population. Now, the reason all of this matters, the reason it's a part of diplomatic history, is that France was supposed to be the most powerful country in Europe. It was supposed to be, if you read the treaty. I mean, security architecture depends ultimately on force. France was supposed to enforce the treaty. You know, they just took all this land from the Germans. Well, who's going to keep the Germans from taking back this land? Yes, the French decide that they'll set up these little treaties with countries like Poland and Czechoslovakia. You know, but these are tiny little parvenu states. Well, I mean, Poland's an old, of course, ancient state, but it hasn't existed since, the fifth partition. Czechoslovakia is just a creation of the Versailles Treaty. Basically now, France is depending on these countries to contain Germany on the one side, and depending only on itself to contain Germany on the other side. Now you might say, well, that doesn't sound too hard. But remember, Germany in the First World War had taken on pretty much the whole world single-handed, right? I mean, the Germans, yeah, they had allies, Austria-Hungary and Turkey. You know, Turkey was fighting its own battles. In terms of Europe, Austria-Hungary was pretty much almost out of the war in the first year. The Germans had to start propping them up immediately. So the Germans are fighting, you know, they're fighting Italy, they're fighting France, Britain, the United States. Yes, they get the Bulgarians on their side, but you know, they're fighting Serbia and the other Balkan states too, like Romania. And of course, Russia. The Germans practically won the war single-handed. And now, Germany, however prostrate and broken, is supposed to be contained essentially by France. A country with a declining population, which is virtually broke, which has no confidence or morale. This is why the French had tried to enlist the Americans in the security architecture. But it hadn't worked. It hadn't worked partly because of Wilson's kind of, shall we say, political stubbornness, partly also because, again, the general tendency of the Americans towards isolationism had reasserted itself. But then, if not the Americans, the French thought, well, at least we should have been able to rely on Britain, because after all, we were comrades in arms. Now, the Americans had only fought in the last 12 months or so of the war, and even they hadn't really seen action until the last 6 months. But Britain had been there from the start. They were comrades in arms who had been fighting together since 1914. But there was very little trust left between France and Britain. Now, some of this did have to do with geopolitics. Now, I alluded to this when I talked about the Balfour Declaration and the Sykes-Picot Agreement in the Middle East. We talked about that the first week, where Britain had really kind of only envisioned turning over Syria and Lebanon to France because they wanted a buffer, that is, against the Russian zone. Then the Russian Revolution happened, Russia fell out of the game, and Britain no longer cared quite so much about the buffer zone. And so Britain concocted the myth that the Arabs had taken Damascus so that they wouldn't have to give Damascus to France. It was all pretty cynical, the whole artifice of it. But basically, the French felt, again, that they had been betrayed by Britain, which had reneged on its promises in the Middle East. The French basically got what? They got Lebanon and like the kind of desert, dry areas of Syria. No oil in either place. The British got Mesopotamia. And while Arabia, while not exactly British, was still kind of a British protectorate. Oil hadn't been discovered there yet, but it would in the 1930s. So now Mesopotamia, with its oil coming into the market, is British. The French got, nada really. You know, they got Lebanon, which was nice. I mean, Beirut, it's a nice city. But it wasn't like it was a major net benefit for France in any kind of economic or strategic sense. France, in terms of what it gained from the First World War in terms of colonies, it was at best a wash. They gained virtually nothing. And they gained, yet again, distrust of the British for having violated their promises. Now, in terms of Turkey, in fact, it was even more dramatic in some cases. I'll talk a little bit more about this next week when we look at least briefly at the Turkish War of Independence. But essentially, even there, as you might know, Ataturk cut a deal with France before he cut a deal with Britain. This was like France's revenge. You know, the British, Lloyd George, basically using the Greeks as proxies, had decided to try to enforce the draconian Sèvres Treaty against Turkey. The French had gone along with it, but they had never really been all that anti-Turkish to begin with. If you remember back at the beginning of the war, France actually held the bulk of Turkey's debt. And so France cut a deal with Kemal long before the British. The French zone, they basically agreed to give up in exchange for the Hatay, basically. They gave up all of Kilikia. And so anyway, so France got to deal with Kemal, and they leave the British kind of twisting in the wind. This is one of the ways in which France tried to get their revenge against Britain. In fact, there was even an episode, you know, even after Izmir had fallen, that is after the Turks had retaken Izmir from the Greeks, the British still had these garrisons, one of them right at Çanak, you know, at Çanakkale. And the French literally pulled out of the garrison, you know, leaving the British alone. In the end, of course, as we know, Kemal did not fire, and, you know, the war did not start between Britain and Turkey. But the British felt like they had been abandoned by the French. So there's really no love lost between them. Which is not that surprising, of course, when you really think about it. Britain and France, after all, had never really been terribly great friends until pretty recently before the First World War. In fact, even in the Second World War, it's a little known fact. The first major British, well, victory, if we can call this, of the Second World War was when they sunk the French Mediterranean fleet at Mers el Kabir off the North African coastline to keep it from falling to the Germans. Britain and France were virtually at war in the Second World War. So we should remember this. They were allies, yes. They were together behind the Sykes-Picot Treaty in a way, yes. They were the victorious countries which imposed the Versailles settlement on the Germans, yes. But there was almost no trust between them. There was no agreement on reparations. There was no agreement on even punishing the Germans, even kind of enforcing these borders. The British showed themselves very sort of weak-kneed on this issue. When they eventually settled this issue at Locarno, this is another treaty in 1925, they did ask the Germans to demilitarize, that is, remove all troops, keep all troops out of the Rhineland, which is this area, on essentially the, the western bank of the Rhine. The Germans more or less accepted these new borders, but the Germans didn't even accept their eastern borders. They said, no, we don't agree. And the British let them get away with signing a treaty where they didn't even accept their eastern borders. So there was no real agreement between the two of them. It didn't help, of course, that the British, with their strong pound, were able to come into France and buy things up really cheaply. It didn't help that the French thought the Americans, who had all the money, were working together with Britain behind their backs. I think what finally killed the whole sense of comedy, though, between the powers was just the general decline in kind of pro-French settlement in Britain. Now, there had always been a little bit of sympathy with the Germans in Britain. There was, to a certain extent, even the notion of kinship or ties of blood. The Anglo-Saxons, after all, some of their descendants came from Saxony, that is. You had Danes and Germanic blood inside the people who eventually became the English. Even the English language, if you study it closely, which I hope all of you have done, you will notice, if you've ever done either French or German, that it's almost like a mixture of the two languages. But the German element comes first, before the French Latinate element, because English is at root a Germanic language. In fact, some of the fashionable racial theories of the time, even Hitler to some extent subscribed to this, the notion that the English were sort of like a superior race and the Germans respected them, as opposed to the Latin and the Slav races. A lot of this notion, again, it had been in the era before, but it started to come back after the war. Eventually, this will produce, this phenomenon we know as appeasement, that is in the 1930s. The British, who simply do not want to go to war with Germany, they don't want to enforce the Versailles Treaty. There's a movie with Anthony Hopkins called Remains of the Day. Has anyone seen this movie that I'm talking about? Emma Thompson. It's a minor classic from the 1990s. It's about this servant, in kind of like one of the great baronial houses. But the baron, the aristocrat of the house, he's loosely based on a real character. And there was a lot of pro-German settlement in the British aristocracy in the 1930s. Some of it going back to these racial notions, some of it a kind of shared anti-Semitism, even though it wasn't as extreme in England. A lot of this stuff, though, also can be traced back to a type of cultural development after the war. I'm going to throw out a term to you here, which I do hope you write down. I think you probably should. It's a small hint. The phenomenon is usually referred to as Bloomsbury. It's not so much a place, although it was a place, as a group and a mentality. Associated with Cambridge as opposed to Oxford, and particularly a secret society at Cambridge known as the Cambridge Apostles. Now, Cambridge and Oxford are similar in certain ways. They're both ancient institutions, but they have certain subtle differences. Cambridge was always a little bit less worldly, in some ways maybe a little more eccentric or academic. It's not that there aren't eccentric academics at Oxford, but that Oxford tended to supply the imperial elite, that is to say, kind of the establishment, those who went to serve the empire. Particularly, there was one college at Oxford called Balliol, which tended to supply all of these civil servants and people high up in the Foreign Office. That is, people who were kind of patriots for the empire, who wanted to serve the British Empire. Now, Cambridge had always worked a little bit more in terms of kind of culture and literature and the arts, a little bit more in terms of influence as opposed to actually working for the country. Now, they thought they were just as important, but in different ways. Now, the Cambridge Apostles were the epitome of this tradition. They were a secret society by election. Like you might have heard of, the Americans, of course, copied a lot of these traditions from the English, like the Skull and Bones Society. Has anyone heard of this? At Yale. George Bush was famously a member of this. It's like this, kind of like fraternities with secret rituals, a little bit like the Freemasons. Now, in this case, it was not like the Freemasons, not like the Skull and Bones, in that it was more of a kind of, not exactly a left-wing thing, but definitely on that side of things. Particularly, their big passion was pacifism. Their big thing, particularly in recent years, was that they had opposed the war. I already alluded to this briefly when I talked about Keynes himself. One of the most important figures of the entire 20th century. The architect of the Bretton Woods settlement of 1944, among other things. Basically the man who dreamed up the IMF and the World Bank. The man who also, of course, was the architect of most of what became orthodox economic theory. Now, Keynes was a Cambridge Apostle. He was a member of this group. He was also, as I have said, homosexual, although he did eventually marry, much to the bewilderment of his other gay friends. And it's still not entirely clear whether it was out of love or whether it was just one of those cosmetic marriages. But he was definitely gay, as were most of the other key members, including Lytton Strachey, who was in a way the kind of leader of this organization. Even calling it an organization is a bit of an exaggeration. Keynes, as I said already, had sent almost like an apology or almost like a love letter to these people, who did not like the fact that he had gone to serve the government in the war, that is in the Treasury Department, because he was an economist. So this is one of the motivations he had for writing this great tract against the Versailles Treaty, the economic consequences of the peace, where he sort of like mocked the politicians, Clemenceau and Lloyd George. He made fun of them, to kind of amuse his pals. And if you remember, this book was extremely significant because it helped ensure that the treaty was defeated in America, where the book was a bestseller, along with many other countries. It also subtly undermined the whole foundations of, again, the kind of establishment position in Britain. That is, it undermined support for the Versailles Treaty. It became kind of fashionable to oppose it, to say the whole thing was unjust. It would all end badly because the Germans had been unfairly punished. So this led, again, more people in Britain not to support France behind reparations. One of the reasons why the government did not, it was a Labour government in 1923, which did not support France in the Ruhr crisis. There were many other causes too, but Keynes's book was an important part of them. Keynes would also later on vociferously criticize the decision to pursue the policy of hard money, that is, of propping up the pound, of going back on the gold standard. Now, it's interesting that this policy, which actually they finally did go back on the gold standard in 1925, the architect of this policy, or at least the one who signed off on it, you'll never guess, it was Winston Churchill. It's amazing. Churchill turns up, he's like a Forrest Gump of the 20th century, right? Winston Churchill seizes Turkey's battleships in July 1914, thus being blamed by a lot of people for provoking Turkey into the war. Churchill is First Lord of the Admiralty during the Gallipoli campaign. He is then, of course, blamed for it and scapegoated for this. And then Churchill falls from grace. And then Churchill comes back a couple of years later, and he's Secretary of War, while Britain is trying to intervene in the Russian Civil War, while Britain is putting down uprisings in places like Iraq and in India, he's Minister of War. Then he disappears for another couple of years. And then he comes back as Chancellor of the Exchequer, which is the British term for, basically like Treasury Secretary. So then this, adventurous politician, general, naval admiral comes back and he enacts the most controversial financial decision of the 1920s. It's extraordinary, this man. Churchill, of course, took the political heat for it. Keynes abused him roundly in public. So that this policy, too, then, even though Britain's policy is to stick to the gold standard, to prop up the pound at $4.86 to the sterling. This policy, too, is kind of subtly being denigrated by everyone who reads Keynes's books. It's kind of Keynes's attacks on this policy, in fact, which allow him eventually to develop what will become what he calls the general theory, on interest, employment, and money, which is one of the great economic tracts of all times. Actually, one brief note on Churchill before I get to the other Cambridge apostles. Because he gets a lot of flack, he gets a lot of abuse, because he always made all these controversial decisions. I'm going to tell you one of the most amazing things about him, though. The beginning of the First World War, as I've said, he was First Lord of the Admiralty, so he's in charge of the Navy. He gets criticized for seizing Turkey's 2 dreadnoughts. He then gets criticized, partly unfairly, for leading to the Gallipoli campaign, which of course costs all these thousands of lives. Well, what do you think most politicians might do if they get humiliated and disgraced and raked under the coals? People are saying, you're responsible for the deaths of these lives of all of these soldiers and sailors. Hundreds of thousands of men are dead because of you. What would a normal politician do if they're getting attacked like that? Yeah, well, I mean, he's fired, basically, so he doesn't even have to resign. But, what would you do next? I don't know, would you, write a memoir or something, justifying yourself? Well, you know what Churchill did? He volunteered to go fight on the Western Front. And he actually went from being First Lord of the Admiralty to a low-ranking officer, in the face of, machine gun fire and shells on the Western Front in the First World War. The man, for all of his faults, had cojones. He was not a coward. And this decision in itself was pretty courageous because for years he was blamed for every economic problem in Britain. Churchill put us on the gold standard. That's why all these people are out of work. Whether or not it was true, that's what people believed. So yet again after this, he goes into the wilderness again, where for 10 or 15 years he is hated and vilified in public. Before eventually, of course, he will emerge as the great hero of the Second World War. But anyway, so Keynes, he's attacking Churchill. He's attacking the Versailles Treaty. He's attacking reparations. He's attacking the gold standard. In all of these ways, he is kind of subtly undermining the confidence of the British establishment. Now, his colleagues are doing it even less subtly than him. They're a little blunter about it. Keynes, he's like clever economist. He's undermining confidence in the government and its foreign policy, yes, but he's doing so in an intelligent way. His buddies were not so subtle. Now, Lytton Strachey, who in a way was the man Keynes wanted to please the most. He was like the, sort of like the father figure of the group. He was a devotee of a philosopher called G.E. Moore, a doctrine called Mooreism, usually translated as the pleasure principle, which basically means if it feels good, do it. Quite literally. Now, it doesn't sound like much of a philosophy, but in a curious way it was. Basically what it meant was, everything they teach you in school, your parents, it's all wrong. You're not supposed to work hard. You're not supposed to serve your country. You're not supposed to be courageous. You're not supposed to deny pleasures. You're not supposed to wait until marriage. You should just do whatever you want right now. Eventually, of course, a version of this doctrine will, as I've said, reappear, in the 60s, free love and all of the rest of it. But, again, it doesn't sound very serious, but he actually put it into a pretty serious book. A book he published called Eminent Victorians. Victorian being a term which basically means, people who lived in the Victorian times, that is, the era before World War I. Now, he took a couple of these figures, like Florence Nightingale, the nurse, the hero of the Crimean War, and he ridiculed her. What sort of woman would sacrifice herself to help wounded soldiers? I'm not even really sure how it worked, but he did. He mocked her. He vilified her. He vilified generals, the kind of people that you would read in your school textbooks, like a Kemal, or for Americans like a George Washington. He ridiculed them. He mocked them, for their manners, for their stiff bearing, for their sort of pretenses, for being anal retentive and not very, cool and relaxed. It sounds kind of crazy, but the thing is, this book hit a nerve because it was published right at the end of the First World War. Basically what he said is everything that went before the war is all to be ridiculed and despised and ended because, look, it led to the First World War, so it's all bad. So you're not supposed to be a patriot. You're not supposed to serve your country. You're not supposed to be courageous and self-sacrificing. Now, in his own personal terms, it's interesting because, like the other Cambridge apostles, he was a pacifist. Only unlike them, he was rather theatrical about it. He was actually put on trial at one point for, essentially draft dodging, that is, for not serving. And so, he went to this kind of country court, and he sort of intimidated everyone, with his big Cambridge accent. But the line that everyone remembered from the trial, which became very famous, was this. He's got his 4 sisters lined up next to him, like for moral support, and to make it look like, he's a decent, brother or something like that. And so anyway, so the prosecutor looks at Strachey, this flamboyant homosexual, and his 4 sisters, and he tries to sort of shame him, to say, look, sir, are you honestly telling me that if the Germans came to our country and invaded, and destroyed your house and raped your sisters, that you would not do anything, you would not take up arms to defend your homeland? What would you do if a German soldier tried to rape your sister? To which he replied, well, I should like to come between them. And everyone remembered this line because it was funny. I mean, it was a funny line and people remembered it. But it basically meant that this was now the right way to do things. You didn't serve your country. It was, in fact, the wrong thing to serve your country. So he didn't just oppose the Versailles Treaty and reparations and all the rest of it like Keynes. But Strachey and his disciples convinced people that they should literally do things like not pay their taxes, don't serve your government, don't join the army, dodge the draft. And eventually it got to the point where in the early 1930s, some of the other associates of the Cambridge apostles, Burgess, Blunt, Long, and Kim Philby. Burgess and Blunt were the 2 really key figures here. They were actually eventually exposed as being part of a major spy ring. They didn't just not serve their country. They took money to spy on their country for a foreign power, that being the Soviet Union, which figured out that the Cambridge apostles were a fertile breeding ground for potential spies who would all go on the payroll. Because eventually some of them did worm their way into the government and then eventually spill its secrets and sell them to the Soviets. It's curious that Burgess and Blunt were actually celebrated a few years ago in a BBC documentary for being courageous nonconformists, who had, I guess, taken money to spy on their own country, which is somehow admirable, I guess. I mean, that's the real Bloomsbury phenomenon. But I want to finally end the Bloomsbury group by mentioning their one sort of honorary female character, because most of them were men, most of them were gay, but not all of them. One of their most famous members to posterity was Virginia Woolf. Known not only as a novelist, but of course, among other things, as a kind of influential feminist. Her book, A Room of One's Own, the notion that essentially that women, they would all eventually be just as great writers and so on as men. But basically her idea was they all needed an allowance. That it'd be much easier for women to succeed in the arts if they had private fortunes like she did, or something like that. But anyway, it was a best-selling novel. Everyone reads it on American college campuses. But I'm going to talk about another book she wrote, because it gives us a fascinating glimpse into what I consider the decadence, eventually, of the modern West, which struck, first Britain and then eventually spread around. Now, it went like this. Her idea is 3 guineas. A guinea, would be a coin. Basically, you'd have like, let's say, these are half guineas. So you got 3 guineas. You're going to take these 3 guineas, and the question is, what do you do with them? What do you support your money with? What are your values? What does she think people should spend their money on? Well, she basically thought, assuming you have spare money to spend, you might want to spend it on something like education. A lot of rich people like to support universities and so on. They still do today. It's prestigious. But here's what she said. Maybe like the Dorimagis might like to build a place like Bilkent. But that's not the kind of place she wanted. Here's what she said. We want a college not to be built out of stone, that is not to be built to be permanent, but of some cheap, easily combustible material which does not hoard dust and perpetrate traditions. She wants it to be something that burns, in other words. She says then she doesn't want libraries, with chained books and kind of antique books under glass cases. She wants the libraries to be all like pictures. I suppose like the internet, basically. She wants it all to be kind of like Facebook and iPods. Let it be decorated anew by each generation as cheaply as possible. So nothing must last, nothing must endure. She finally says in the end that this guinea of your money that you're going to spend, it should never go to rebuild any college according to the old plan. It should be earmarked, quote, rags, petrol, matches. And this note should be attached to it. Take this guinea, and with it burn the college to the ground. Set fire to the old hypocrisies. Let the light of the burning building scare the nightingales. And let the daughters of educated men, this is her word for, I guess, like rich women or something like that, feminists, dance around the fire and heap armful upon armful of dead leaves upon the flames. And let their mothers lean from the upper windows and cry, let it blaze, for we have done with this education. You guys know Pink Floyd? We don't need no education. We don't need no thought control. Well, if you want to see where this ends, aside from in Pink Floyd in the 1970s, Woolf finally gave her opinion on the questions of the day. So, of course, she said that basically, Britain was just as fascist as Germany. This is in the late 1930s, and Hitler was no big deal. That basically, the British were worse. And so she finally said that if there were a war with Nazi Germany, she said the first duty of any Briton, and she's talking to women mostly because she's a woman, she said, her first duty is not to fight. Your second duty is not to build weapons, and your third duty, remember the attack on Florence Nightingale, is not to nurse the wounded. So she's telling women, in case Nazi Germany invades and starts killing people, you should not help the injured or the wounded. The next duty would be to tell everyone else not to fight and to convince everyone that the ultimate posture they should take vis-a-vis an invasion by a hostile power is one of complete indifference. So this, anyway, is where the Bloomsbury attitude leads. I will say in defense of Virginia Woolf that after the Second World War began and the Germans began bombing London and killing civilians, she kind of rethought some of this. And she decided that maybe it wasn't the worst thing in the world to actually support your country in the time of a war. But of course, by that point, she had already gone into print. So anyway, the Bloomsbury Group is something to remember because it does say something about the failure of will, the collapse of morale in Britain. The collapse of morale in France was more of a kind of physical phenomenon, aging population, loss of wealth, loss of patrimony. In Britain, I think it was more of a moral phenomenon. It was kind of an intellectual failure, maybe an exhaustion. But eventually this does have consequences because it leads to this widespread attitude of appeasement in the 1930s where everyone decides that it's much better to cut a deal with Hitler than to risk fighting him. So that's it for today.